So you are all welcome once more to a Ladder Back Down session where we'll be discussing CRISC in the workplace. And I've deliberately included the logo, the full logo of the Ladder Back Down, because in 2004, I delivered a session to a group of students who were going off to university. And I titled my presentation, Who Says You Can't? That is, nobody can say that you can't be a successful professional or successful person, successful businessman, successful businesswoman, success in whatever you do, unless you yourself say that you can't be successful. And I'd like to say the same thing to anyone that's enrolled on this session today and towards next week, that nobody can say to you that you can't be a successful risk manager unless you say that to yourself. Nobody can say to you that you can't be a successful professional unless you say that to yourself. So please don't worry about where you're coming from, where you may not have any knowledge of risk currently. You may not have any knowledge of IT currently. You may not have any knowledge of information technology, information security. You may not have any certifications. You may not have any qualifications. You may not be a graduate. It does not matter. Nobody can tell you that you can't form a successful career in risk, in information security, in IT, unless you say that to yourself. So please remember that saying, who says you can't? Nobody can tell you that you can't be successful in your career unless you say that to yourself. So we'll be discussing the role of the CRISC professional in the workplace. That is an individual professional that is certified in risk in information security and in the controls of those risks. So CRISC in the workplace, we'll be discussing quite a few nuggets of what a CRISC, or indeed an information security risk professional who hasn't sat the certification exams, what they actually do in the workplace, what you're required to do in the workplace. In the industry, because the IT and InfoSec industry is really certification driven, we often see a lot of professionals who come in who have sat the certification, but they don't have that hands-on experience or that real world experience. And the aim of this workshop is really to discuss what you will be doing in the workplace as a CRISC professional, what you're required to do, the knowledge you're expected to have. And I hope that at the end of this workshop, that we will have engaged in sufficient discussion for you to feel empowered to go about your business efficiently and effectively as an information risk professional. So over the course of the 2-day series, we'll be taking a look at definitions, information risk definitions, and we'll be discussing these. We'll also be taking a look at the risk domains of a CRISC qualified professional. We'll be taking a look at risk identification, risk assessments, how to conduct risk assessments, risk monitoring, and risk reporting. What is risk? Now, very often I've discussed risk with individuals, talking about risk, trying to invite people to consider a risk career. And I frequently obtain feedback saying, I'm not interested in risk. risk is too risky, or I don't know anything about risk, or you need too much knowledge to become a risk manager. I frequently get that feedback, and I often say, or I ask the question, who is a risk manager? And I'll ask that question of us, and I'd like one or two people to provide a response. Who is a risk manager? What does a risk manager do? So could two people please unmute their mics, and please remember to mute yourselves once you've answered the question. Sorry. So who is a risk manager? If we can respond in the chat window, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. I like Victoria's response there. She's written, I am an unofficial risk manager for my family. I am on the constant lookout to keep them safe. Thank you. That's a very good answer. Who else is a risk manager? Who else is a risk manager here? Can anyone else tell us what a risk manager does before I ask this question again? Thank you. Daniel has said a risk manager is someone charged with the responsibility of identifying risks and mitigating risks. So may I ask the question again? Who is a risk manager here? Who has managed risks before? Who has ever managed risks before? Okay. Mr. Odeshola has said he has. Okay. We've got Daniel has said he has managed risks before, and we've got Emmanuel has said he's managed risks before. Risk managers spot threats and vulnerabilities and ways to mitigate them. So I've got all these amazing definitions of risk, but I've only had a few individuals say that they're actually risk managers. A risk manager communicates risk policies and processes for an organization. Now, I think we'll go back to Victoria's initial statement. Victoria said, I am an unofficial risk manager for my family. I am on the constant lookout to keep them safe. May I put it to everyone on this session that each and every one of you are an unofficial risk manager. Because from the moment you wake up till the moment you go to sleep, you are managing risk. You may not appreciate that fact, but you are managing risk on a daily basis. Let's say you have an interview booked. What do you do when you have an interview booked? You've been told you've got an interview booked, an in-person, face-to-face interview. And your interview will be in the city. What do you start checking towards that interview? What do you start checking towards that interview? We can have responses in the chat window. Yes, you check the weather. You check your journey plan, your train times. What else do you check? What else do you check towards an interview? Yes, how to get there safely. And why do we check all these things? So let's go on to the why now. Means of transport. Yes, why do we check these things? What are we seeking to manage in checking the transport times or the means of transport, in checking the weather? What are we seeking to reduce? So we've gone about there in roundabout ways here. So we've said to ensure no disruption and get there early, not to get there late, to see what is within our control and what is not, and enhance our chances of success, to ensure no disruption and get there early, fluidity, knowing how to best adapt. All of these things are simply saying that we check the weather, we check our journey times, we check our means of transport to reduce the risk of not arriving at that interview on time. So we're literally managing a risk. We're trying to reduce a risk of not arriving at the venue on time. We're seeking to check the weather so that we don't arrive drenched or wet if it suddenly starts raining whilst we're on our way. So in everything that we're doing there, we're seeking to reduce a risk, to manage a risk. When we eat at certain times during the day, what are we seeking to reduce the risk of? We're seeking to reduce the risk of us passing out due to hunger or falling ill due to us not getting nourishment in our bodies. So in every waking moment, we are managing risk. If you're an HR manager, for example, you're managing people risk. The risk of recruiting the wrong people to roles. If you're a marketing manager, you're managing the risk of not engaging with enough customers or clients to boost the business's profitability. If you're a financial manager, you're managing the credit risk or market risk. So we're always managing risk. We're always managing risk in our day-to-day jobs. In our day-to-day jobs, we are always managing risk. So we're all risk managers. In our day-to-day lives, we are always managing risk. So thank you everyone for your contribution. So let's now take a look at a definition of risk, or some definitions of risk. A risk could be described as a vulnerability that could be exploited by a threat. So in essence, if there is no vulnerability, there can't be a risk. If there's a threat but no vulnerability to be exploited, then there's no risk. And if there's a threat but no vulnerability, or a vulnerability but no threat, then there's no risk. Let's give an example. If you live in a gated area where your house is gated, there's a police station inside the gated area, there's no traffic allowed within 100 miles of the gated area that you live, unless it's someone that lives in that area. You've got all those precautions, and then you've got a broken lock on your door. The broken lock on your door is a vulnerability, but because there is no threat, because you have a secure area that you're living in, where you're in a gated community, no one can come into that community unless they have a pass, for example. That means that there's a very low risk, if any risk at all, because you've got the vulnerability of the broken lock, but there's no threat. Because of the gates in your community, because of the access passes, which means that nobody can come into that area unless they have a pass, unless they actually live in that small gated community. So a risk consists of both a vulnerability and a threat. It's a weakness in controls that could be exploited by a threat. According to ISO IEC 73, a risk is described as the probability of an event occurring and its impact or consequences. And we will take a look at this as we go through the workshop. We're just giving high-level definitions here. Now, risks are often seen as an adverse event, as a negative event. But there could also be opportunities in risks. Can anyone write in the chat window, please, what they view could be an opportunity as a result of a risk? So responses in the chat window, please. And then if one of our co-hosts could kindly read out the responses in the chat window, please, thanks. Well, so the question I've just asked is, could anyone think of a risk that could be converted into an opportunity? A risk that could be converted into an opportunity. Can anyone think of that, or one, please? Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. A risk that could be converted into an opportunity. Yes, so a risk that helps to identify change could be converted into an opportunity, but I'm just looking for any specific risks that could be converted into an opportunity. A specific risk that we can think of? A merger and acquisition. Okay, and how might that be converted into an opportunity? Okay, so Emmanuel has said the risk of losing customers might create an opportunity to increase profit. I might say that the risk of losing employees could create opportunities to enhance profit. Old system or software, but I love what Victoria has said here. Any vulnerability in a company may create an opportunity for a cybersecurity professional to get hired. Let's now turn this round on its head and just actually explain what we mean by a risk creating an opportunity. Let's say a company is in the business of making, producing information security or cybersecurity anti-malware software, or antivirus software, or anti-ransomware software. If there is a risk identified that all companies in the UK may be at risk of a specific virus from a political activist, for example, that would present an opportunity for this antivirus company to prepare software or to develop software to protect those companies in the UK. Does that make sense now? So if there is a risk that all companies in the UK might be attacked by a political activist using software, that would present an opportunity to an antivirus company to develop new products to protect those companies. So risk is not always negative. Risk is not always negative. There are sometimes opportunities for a new product or a new process to enhance the value of an organization. Risk impacts information assets. And I think that's something that is so important for us to recognize as information security professionals, because I often meet individuals who say, no, I'm just interested in the technology. I'm just interested in programming. I'm just interested in the architecture. But I often say or respond that the information security criminal or cyber criminal is not interested in your architecture. They're not interested in our certifications. They're not even interested in our knowledge. The information security criminal or cyber criminal is only interested in one thing, and that is in gaining access to your corporate or even personal information assets. They're just interested in gaining access to those information assets at whatever cost to themselves. Cyber criminals will go to any lengths to gain access to your information assets. And I'll speak on that again later. But a risk exploits vulnerabilities, as I've said there, weaknesses. If there are no weaknesses in your controls, the risk simply does not exist. A risk will always exploit a weakness, a broken lock, an unpatched system, untrained employees, and we'll talk about these later. Yes, a risk always exploits a weakness. A weakness is the same as a vulnerability, a weakness or a vulnerability in our controls. Different risk factors. What may cause or present a risk to our organizations? And I know that some people here may say, why do I need to know this? But we will talk later about the knowledge required of an information security or IT risk professional. Yes, we do need to know all of this. But here are some risk factors. Changes in economic conditions, changes in market trends. New competition could pose a risk to our organizations. New legislation could definitely pose a risk to our organizations. Natural disasters, legacy equipment, which I see that, that Ms. Odeshala mentioned earlier, legacy equipment, where the company is using equipment that was designed 50 years ago, unsupported, no longer supported by the manufacturer. They no longer release patches, if they ever did, if it was designed 50 years ago when there wasn't that much risk or that much cybercrime. So legacy equipment, strained labor relations with employees. That is a risk factor. Again, we'll talk about all of these in depth later. What is the main goal of risk management? The main goal is to reduce the risk to our information assets to an acceptable level. The aim of risk management is not to eliminate risk. Why? Why are we not seeking to eliminate risk? If we can write our responses in the chat window, please. Why are we not seeking to eliminate risk? Why are we simply seeking to reduce the risk to our assets to an acceptable level? If we can just respond in the chat window, because nothing is 100%. Thank you. Anything else? Risk cannot be totally eliminated. Okay, thank you. Risk can only be managed. Okay, thank you. Because of inherent risk. Thank you, and we will talk about that. Victoria says, because security is a negative goal, a company needs to focus on their goals in producing their products or services. Thank you. Any other comments? Risk is to be controlled to our advantage, but cannot be totally reduced. Thank you to everyone who's commented, and that is absolutely true. We can only reduce risk, but we cannot eliminate risk, because a company does need to focus on their goals. And the only way that we can eliminate risk is if the business were to stop doing what it's doing. If the business were to close, then there would be no risk, but no job as well. So we cannot eliminate risk. Please remember that. We cannot eliminate risk unless we close shop and go. Reduction of risk to our information assets to an acceptable level. And we'll see later who is meant to accept the risk. We'll be taking a look at risk assessment methods, including the quantitative risk analysis method and the qualitative risk analysis method. Management also involves the consideration of the different risk treatment options. That is, do we want to accept the risk, reduce the risk, transfer the risk? But remember, we're not seeking to eliminate risk. And then as part of our risk management activities, we then select the appropriate risk treatment, and then we implement that risk treatment, especially when it comes to risk reduction. If we're seeking to reduce the risk, if the business, rather than us as information security professionals, decide to reduce the risk, then we could then get involved in risk treatment to actually reduce the risk. And then we're also responsible for the ongoing monitoring and reporting of risk. Enterprise risk management. Risk must be managed in a consistent manner within each firm. So if you're a risk professional, you may find yourself in a position whereby when you change jobs, your new company manages risk in a different manner to your old company. And you can't then go into your new company and say, this is how we used to manage things in our previous company. And so I'd like us to manage things this way here. The idea is that we move into a new company and we immediately align ourselves with the way that our new company manages their risk. Whilst recognizing that in our company, a risk in one business unit is a threat to all other business units of the firm. So let's say you have identified a risk in the finance systems, in the customer payments or billing and invoice systems. If there's a critical risk in the customer billing system, that could suggest that customers are not being billed, which would impact upon the revenue or income of your company, which could impact on the profitability of the company, which could impact on each business unit, on the finances available to fund each business unit. An employee risk or employee attrition risk where all employees, where you've got a load of employees departing the company, disgruntled employees. That is a risk to the entire firm. If you have all your IT employees leaving the firm because they're disgruntled, that is a risk to the entire firm, to all other business units, who will then be unsupported. Even if you hire and replace immediately. Look at what happened with P&O ferries recently. For those of us in the UK, we may have read about what happened. They made a whole load of staff redundant and rehired a new set of employees. And then they started failing health and safety regulations. And so some of their ferries were grounded for a while. So what was initially an HR risk, an HR issue, affected the entire business operations. So remember that with enterprise risk management, the IT or InfoSec risk professional has a role to play. And we need to understand that risk must be managed in a consistent manner within each firm that we choose to work in. And a risk in one business unit, a risk in InfoSec, an IT risk, is a threat to all other business units of the firm that you'll work with. Any questions in the chat window, please? Questions in the chat window? Okay, what we are going to do is that we're going to take a 15-minute tea break. And if anyone wants to stop and answer questions, once I've paused the recording, we can actually do that. So we can ask questions and then we will resume at 11 o'clock then. So thank you so much for that interesting discussion during the break. And we'll now take a look at different concepts of IT risk management. IT risk management and business risk management. What is the link? It's important that we understand that when we're talking about an IT incident or an InfoSec breach or incident, the impact must be measured based on the cost to the business rather than the impact on IT. The impact of an IT incident must be measured based on its impact to the business. What has it stopped? What has this incident stopped the business from achieving? What operations have been impacted on by this IT incident? Has HR been unable to pay our 50,000 employees due to an incident or a glitch in the payroll system? The impact on the business. The billing system that has gone down. Has the business been unable to bill 5,000 customers per day? Has the business been unable to sell products today due to a problem with the customer order system? So the impact must be measured based on its impact to the business, rather than based on the impact to the IT system. The IT system is down. So what impact has that had on the business? And I've written there that it's not about us, really. IT risk management is not about us as IT risk professionals. It's about the business. It's about protecting the business. It's not about protecting IT systems. It's about protecting, making sure that we're protecting the business, that we're enabling the business to continue its operations. And the IT risk strategy must always be driven by the firm's risk culture that is set by the senior management team and the board. And we'll have more to say on that shortly. The relationship between IT and the business has a vital and important effect on the business's ability to achieve its objectives. If there's no relationship between IT and the business will struggle to achieve its objectives, to adopt new technologies, and also to lower employee resistance to IT and information security controls. If IT professionals, IT leaders, IT InfoSec risk professionals and leaders don't have a good relationship with the business, then the business will struggle to achieve its core objectives. It will struggle to adopt new technologies if IT and information security risk professionals don't have a good relationship with the business, with business units, with other business teams, then employees will resist any controls or any of our efforts to safeguard the company's information assets. If we say to the business, we want to introduce a new software to reduce incidences of information security breaches, or introduce a new software to reduce incidents of phishing. If we don't have a good relationship with the business, employees will not be willing to adopt that new software. They will not be willing to use that new software. So if possible, They will disregard the IT risk management team's directive to use that software unless we have a good relationship with the business and employees. So we're not only IT or information security risk professionals, we're also relationship managers, relationship builders. That is so key to our profession, the ability to build relationships. And I often hear risk professionals complaining about other employees. They just don't want to do this. They don't want to do that. Don't they understand that this tool can protect them from XYZ? Sometimes all it takes is engagement, discussions. And I'm not talking about workshops now. I'm talking about discussions, real relationship building, where we're trying to find out our employees' pain points. What are your pain points? Can we help you as IT risk professionals to reduce the pain? How can we help you? How can we implement tools that will help rather than hinder you in your job? Sometimes we say, oh, they wouldn't understand. They simply wouldn't understand. But imagine if payroll were to say to you, you need to adopt a new process. Off you go, just go and do it for you to get paid without explaining how you adopt that new process. And they say, well, if you don't understand, that's your problem. You just don't get paid. No, if payroll is introducing a new process or a new software or a new system, they take their time to explain. This is what we require you to do, else you won't get paid. So we build relationships. Never disregard the power of having good relationships with different business units, with employees, including your security guards and cleaners. And I'll explain why later. But it's important that we have good relationships from the board to our facilities staff, including security guards and cleaners. I'll explain why, but it would be nice to also see some suggestions in the chat window, which I'll check in a moment to see why, suggestions as to why we need to develop good relationships, including with our facilities staff. Risk professionals, who are they? Well, we've got our risk professionals responsible for governance, which is our board and the senior management team. Then we've got risk professionals responsible for the management of risk, and they're tech, cyber, and infosec risk professionals and all employees, again, including our facilities staff. Let's take a look at the information risk management life cycle. The information risk management professional may be engaged in disciplines such as portfolio, program, or project risk, business continuity management, or disaster recovery, audit, and again, information security risk, cybersecurity risk, or technology risk. And here is the life cycle across the board. We're responsible for identifying the risk. We assess risk. We monitor risk, and we report on risk. So the first step is to identify the risks that our companies may face. Then we conduct a risk assessment where we take a look at our vulnerabilities, we take a look at our threats, the threats that may exploit those vulnerabilities. Then we monitor and then we report on those risks. And that is an iterative process in that it is repeated. It's not a one-off exercise. We repeatedly do this day in and day out in our workplaces. Identify the risk, assess the risk, monitor the risk, report on the risk. That is the information risk management life cycle. I've got a question here. Are cyber security risk professionals, technology risk professionals, and information security risk professionals the same, or are we different? And the second question is, what should be our focus? So let's take a look in the chat window for our responses. So 2 questions there. Is the cyber, technology, and information security risk professional the same or different? And what should be our focus as cyber technology or information security risk professionals? What should be our main focus? And I've given away that answer earlier in the session. Responses in the window, thank you. And thank you to Victoria, who's originally answered in terms of, you never thought of security guards and cleaners and, to add them to the scope of risk managers. But we'll talk about that shortly. Okay. So thank you. Really engaging, Victoria here. You're taking a wild guess. Cyber risk is the focus of responding to the imminent threat. Tech risk is the focus of responding to preserve and protect the data. Our focus should be to identify the risk. Our focus is helping the business meet its objectives in a safe manner. Yes, so it's all about the business. And Omolola has said to make sure information and data is safe. Tracking the security register, yes, that's all. Yes, okay. Tracking the security register, that's the responsibility of everyone in their, in amongst those professionals. Jeremiah said, I'd say they are different. Cyber has to do with the internet. InfoSec has to do with both online and offline risk assessments. Yep, getting close. Sarah has given a real technical answer. It depends. Daniel said different, but pretty much the same tools, techniques, and their impact to the business is the overall goal. So thank you so much. Yes, and Each of these are interrelated. So the cyber professional, I think as Jeremiah said, is mainly concerned with cyberspace and the security of the internet and internet related issues. Technology risk professionals largely concerned with the technologies, the physical hardware that we work with. There are also software risk professionals that are concerned about applications that we work with. You know, our Word, our PowerPoint, Excel, and the different applications, apps that are developed for our mobile devices. So those are software risk professionals. Cyber, the online and network in some cases space. Technology is about the infrastructure, the hardware largely. Information security risk professionals, as Jeremiah, I think, has said, also is about, they're concerned with not only information on our technical assets or our physical hardware, they're also concerned with information stored in files and folders, for example. How many times have you walked around in your company and you've seen keys to private cabinets or lockers left in the doors of the cabinets or lockers? So an information security risk professional is concerned with both information online and in physical files and folders and in safes. Should be our focus. I'm not sure if I heard or if I read, I think I did read here, our focus is helping the business to meet its objectives in a safe manner. Thank you for that definition. But I'd like a one-worded answer, or maybe a two-worded answer to that in terms of our focus as risk professionals. What should be our focus? And I've mentioned this previously. What should be our focus? What is the cyber criminal focusing on? Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Our information assets. Whether we're a cyber risk professional, an information security risk professional, or a technology risk professional, our main focus should be on the information assets, because that's what we're seeking to protect. And that is what the cyber criminal out there is focusing on. They're not focusing on the technologies that you're using. They're not focusing on your skill as an information security risk professional. All they're focusing on is the information assets that they're seeking to steal, to get their hands on. And so when I hear professionals boast of the latest technologies and their knowledge of the technologies, I just pause and think, does this person understand the need to focus on the information assets? Because if you're not focusing on those assets, you're simply focusing on the technologies without understanding that you're actually there not to just work on those technologies, secure the technologies, without understanding what you're actually seeking to protect at the back end, which is the information. You may find that with everything that you do, with all of your knowledge about that information system or software or antivirus tool, cyber criminals are still able to access your infrastructure to gain access to the information assets. That's why you see big companies get hacked into, because we have technologists focusing on learning everything about different technologies. We have risk managers focusing on the steps to mitigate the risk, rather than focusing on, first and foremost, the information assets that they're seeking to protect. And the cyber criminal of today isn't required to have that much skill. When I first started out in IT and then information security later, it required skill to hack into a system. A skill that I still haven't learned. I'm not a certified ethical hacker or any sort of hacker at all. I still haven't learned that because it's not of interest to me. But when I first started out, it required great skill to actually learn how to, but nowadays, a young script kiddie, as we call them, could go onto the internet, go onto the dark web, or even go onto YouTube and learn how to hack into a system. Learn how to bypass all the controls that we put in place to safeguard our information assets. So our focus should be on the information assets that we're seeking to protect, including the value of those information assets to the company. And then we can then work on acquiring knowledge of the skills, acquiring knowledge of the different technologies that we can use to protect the information assets in our company. Our focus, information assets. So thank you for that, Sarah. Well, let's take a look at some information risk terminologies. Assets, what are assets? The word assets means the same in any discipline. Information or systems of value to a company or to our firms, to our company. And the assets that are valuable to one company may not be valuable to another company. In one company, it may be critical that we have X-ray systems that are wireless X-ray systems that can be carried around to patients' bedsides in a hospital. A wireless scanning system that can be carried around to patients' bedsides in a hospital that sends information back to a control room or back to GPs or doctors remotely. That system wouldn't be as valuable in another firm that isn't focused on healthcare. Designs, systems designs. A company that develops a software to, well, let's say a company that develops manufacturing software for a manufacturing company. That asset will be valuable to that company alone. But if a company that maybe sells donuts, I like donuts, so let's use the example donuts. If a company that sells donuts were to lay hands on that software would not be valuable to them because it is not their core business. So we need to recognize, as soon as we get into a company, into a job, we need to recognize the information assets that we have been hired to protect. We need to go and identify, find out which information, which systems are of the highest value to our firms. And then our efforts should be targeted towards protecting those information assets of value to our firms. What are threats? Threats, and we'll be talking about different threat actors later. Threats are actors that are likely to cause harm. Threat actors or factors likely to cause harm if they were to exploit a vulnerability. And a vulnerability, as we've said earlier, is a weakness, or vulnerabilities are weaknesses in our risk controls. We'll talk about different examples of those vulnerabilities. Risk is calculated by assessing the probability and times in that by the impact of that risk if it were to materialize. Again, we will talk about all of this later. Impact, that is the effect of a risk materializing. Now, avoid. How can we avoid a risk? We can stop the action that has given rise to risk. As I said earlier, we can close shop. We can choose to say, we're not doing this business anymore. Or we're stopping that department. We're closing down that department. We're closing down that project. That's the only way that we can avoid a risk. We can reduce a risk by seeking to minimize either the probability of the risk to reduce the probability of the risk materializing, or we can seek to reduce the impact of the risk if it were to occur. So let's say, for example, one's in a fire station or a petrol station rather. We can seek to minimize the probability of a fire by putting out notices, no smoking at the fire pumps, turn off the engine at the fire pumps. And then, if we're seeking to minimize the impact of a fire at the petrol stations, we have buckets with sands, fire extinguishers. We provide training to our staff to enable them to evacuate the petrol station as soon as there's a fire. We can also choose to transfer the risk by outsourcing or insuring against the risk. And we'll take a look at all of this later today or next week, Saturday. Or we can choose to accept the risk. And we accept the risk where the cost of reducing the risk outweighs the benefit of the treatment. Again, we'll talk about that when we do a brief risk benefits analysis. Questions, please, in the chat window. Questions, comments, contributions, please, in the chat window. Let's go back to assets once more. So an asset is something that is of value to our organizations. It has to be of value. If it's not of value to our organization, we shouldn't be seeking to protect that asset. Why? May I ask that question? Why? Why might we not seek to secure or protect an asset that is not of value? Why might we not seek to protect an asset that is not of value to an organization? Thank you. That's the exact answer that we were looking for, because a company has limited resources. Thank you, Victoria. A company has limited resources, so they can't secure everything. And one of the issues with information security is that we don't necessarily bring in a revenue for a company. So we have to demonstrate the return on investment to the board, to senior management. For each investment that we ask for, we have to demonstrate that we are actually protecting the company from a real risk. Whereas if an asset is of limited value to the company, we shouldn't be proposing that our companies invest in protecting that asset. A company has limited resources, as Victoria said, and so we should only be recommending that the company protects or invests those resources in assets that are of value to the company. What is the most valuable asset in a company? Can someone pop the answer in the chat window, please? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So quite a few individuals have got divided responses here, but the most valuable asset actually is people. And then second comes the data. But without people, a business cannot do its job. So even for any InfoSec exam, the answer is always people. The answer is always employees. And then we then have data coming a second, a second close option to that. So people, employees, and then information. But as an information risk manager, information assets is what we seek to protect, to secure. Assets could also be intangible assets, such as reputation or brand. Why is reputation an intangible asset? Can anyone give an answer to that? Why is reputation an intangible asset? Responses in the chat window? Okay, paves the way before you shapes how people would interact with you before they meet you. Yep, okay. It can't be grasped and it's not visible like the other assets, cannot be felt with the five senses. They are not physical in nature. Yep, I think we're all saying the same thing here. You can't measure the value of reputation. You can't put a price on reputation or brand. You can't actually put a price on it. You can't put an exact dollar figure to the price of reputation. Yes, and some people have answered yes, that it can affect the company's competition. It can help to grow the integrity of the business if a company has a good reputation. Yes, that's quite true. However, we still can't put a dollar value to reputation or brand. That's why it may be intangible. And moving on to the next point here, the calculation of value may be difficult or impossible of the value of IT. The calculation of the value that we deliver as information technology or information security risk professionals may be difficult or impossible. It's very difficult for IT and InfoSec departments to quantify the value of what they deliver. It's always been difficult to go to a board presenting your annual budget. And when they say, okay, what have you protected us from over the past year? It's difficult to say, this is what I've protected you from. Yes, you may have statistics in terms of how many attempts there have been to hack into your web server or your customer order system or all of that. But it's really difficult to demonstrate the value of information risk management. But we keep trying because we play an important role. We play the role of policing our information assets and protecting our companies from harm. And our organizations may suffer if an asset is lost or impaired or destroyed. We may suffer regulatory breaches, fines. We may suffer a reduction in share price. Talk. They experienced the hacking many years ago now. And I looked at their share price. The last time I looked at their share price was last year sometime. And they still hadn't recovered to their pre-breach levels, their share price. Some companies have actually folded due to a breach or a hack into their systems, or indeed a ransomware attack against them. Many companies have had to fold, especially small companies, because they've experienced a breach. Whereas prior to the breach, they may have hired an information security risk professional or a consultant or whoever who may have found it difficult to actually explain, justify the reasons for asking the company to invest in information security, which is why I prefer the quantitative risk assessment method, which we'll be talking about either later today or next week. But it's important that we develop that skill of being able to calculate, prepare some rough figures, because that is the language that the board understands. That is the language that senior management understands. Show me the figures. What is this going to cost? What is the return on investment? What return will I get if I were to invest 100K in that new information security tool? What is risk governance and what is risk management? And who does risk governance? Who does risk management? Governance, overseen by the board and senior management team. And I'd like to say this. There's been a lot of debate about information security directors, CIOs, CISOs, chief risk officers do tend to sit on boards, but information security senior managers and IT senior managers, there's been a lot of debate over the years with regards to whether they should be allowed a seat on the board or not. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I know that some of us here are board trustees on small organizations, within small organizations. Now, let's just say this really carefully. I attended a board director's training course over the course of a year with the IOD a few years ago now. On the first day of that course, the instructor talked about the legal obligations of a board director. When he finished his talk, the 16 delegates, including me, were just dumbstruck because we thought, I'm not sure if I want to be a board director. Once we understood the legal obligations of a board trustee. So here now, what we're saying is governance is the responsibility of the board, who are answerable to regulators, who are answerable to the legal system. Governance, risk governance is their responsibility. The senior management team, of whom some may also sit on the board, such as the chief financial officer, for example, the chief human resources officer, you may have the auditor, company auditor on the board, and different functions. The CEO will definitely sit on the board. But they are accountable for risk governance and all governance across the organization. Governance, the board, SMT, they evaluate stakeholder needs, conditions, and options. That's their role in risk governance. They evaluate what the information security manager or chief information security risk manager, or whatever they're called, they evaluate what they need along with the needs of other departments. The board and SMT determines the organization's objectives, the corporate objectives. They then direct action through prioritization and decision-making. So as information security risk professionals or IT risk professionals, cyber risk professionals, we are not the ultimate decision makers. So again, it's not all about you and me. It's about obtaining direction from the board and SMT once we have provided them with enough risk knowledge to enable them to make informed decisions. Informed risk decisions. If we are not providing the board and SMT with enough information through our risk assessments and our risk action plans and our risk monitoring reports, if we're not providing them with enough information to reach decisions, we are doing our organizations a misservice. So we provide the board and SMT with information to enable them to reach informed decisions and release the funds for us to effectively manage the risk to our information assets. The governance through the board and SMT monitors performance and compliance against the agreed on direction and the corporate objectives. How do they monitor performance and compliance? What do they need for them to be able to monitor performance and compliance? They need our reports. They need reports from us, which are clear, straight to the point, with no technical jargon. I know as information security professionals and as IT professionals, we tend to be quite proud of our knowledge, of our skills, especially technical architects. However, we need to recognize that the business, the board, senior management team, they may not have the technical knowledge that we have. And so we have a responsibility to present our reports in clear, concise, layman's language that they can understand. And I note that Victoria posed the question, what dashboards do I recommend for risk reporting? It depends on your company. In most cases, if you're going into a company, they will already have their own dashboard. they will already have their own dashboard, in which case it would be your responsibility to learn that dashboard. Although they may actually ask you, okay, could you come and present us with some metrics that you might suggest for us to use to measure and monitor our risk here? That's usually in a small company. But most companies will have their own tools. So governance, the responsibility of the board and SMT. Risk management is the responsibility of IT, risk managers, cyber risk managers, information security risk managers, and who else? Can anyone put that answer there? I've put a question mark here. Could anyone put an answer in the dashboard, in the chat window? Yes, and Victoria, you've asked, what you were to make a dashboard from scratch? Yes, in some organizations, if they don't have one, you could make a dashboard from scratch using whatever tools are available, but it's best to not use bespoke tools. Because if you use bespoke tools, what happens when you leave the company? Use tools that are available for everyone to use, that anyone can learn. And then you just move, there's loads of business intelligence tools out there by Microsoft, for example, and other providers. Just use something that they'd be able to readily learn themselves. Yes, and I've got the answer to that question from the first response there. Risk management is the responsibility of IT, cyber, InfoSec risk, and users. Everyone in the business is responsible for risk management, including, as we said earlier, the facility staff. They're responsible for building, running activities, plans, build, run, monitor activities in alignment with the directions set by governance. And they work together to achieve the organization's objectives. So again, remember that we said that everyone is responsible for risk management. Everyone is responsible for highlighting a risk. If you're not monitoring, if you're not listening out for risks, then how do you highlight risks to the business, to IT, to InfoSec? That risk could be a colleague consistently leaving their workstation open whilst going for lunch, and you've told them time and time again. It's a risk. You need to escalate that. After having told them time and time again, you escalate to your line manager, who may want to have a word with them. They could be doing that because they've got a disability. You don't know, but you're still responsible for notifying someone of that risk, because it is a risk. So everyone is responsible for risk management across the company. But when it comes to the planning, the building, and the leading on risk management efforts, then the IT, cyber, and InfoSec risk professional will play a lead role in that. But everyone, if your users are not engaged, if they're not involved in working with you to achieve the organization's objectives, then your information security risk management efforts may not be as successful as you want them to be. What is governance? We've talked about this already. It is the accountability for the protection of the assets of an organization. What does accountability mean? So again, going back to that training that I said that I did to become a board trustee, accountability means that you are answerable to regulators, to shareholders, to customers, to employees for the running of the company, including for the protection of information assets in the organization. So whilst a board will delegate responsibility to different senior managers, including the chief information officer when it comes to IT, and the CISO, chief information security officer, when it comes to information security, they cannot delegate accountability for those roles. They can delegate the responsibility for the protection of assets, but they cannot delegate accountability. If the regulators need to ask questions, they ask questions of the board. The CEO will usually sit on the board and they'll be asking questions. They won't be asking questions of the CISO or the CIO unless they're on the board, or the head of information security, or the IT risk professional that got something wrong. They will be asking questions of the board. What controls did you put in place to prevent that risk from materializing? So the board remains accountable for the protection of assets. They remain answerable to shareholders, as I said, to the regulator, to the law. That is what governance means. Board is responsible for financial accountability, operational effectiveness, legal and human resources compliance, social responsibility, governance of IT investment and operations, and risk culture accountability. Again, I know that we have a few board members on this workshop. And so whilst this is part of the CRISC syllabus, it's also important that we understand that we can't just go into a firm as a risk professional or a risk trustee on a board without understanding our responsibilities and what we're accountable for. We're accountable for. What is the board responsible for with regards to risk culture, and what risk cultures contribute towards a positive or negative risk environment? Now, someone asked the question earlier, what do I do in a firm where they don't take risk seriously? And I responded that you need to reach a decision as to whether you want to continue to work in that organization or you want to move on. If you find that you are not in a position that is influential enough to gain access to the board, or if you're in an organization where you have done what you've been paid to do and no one is responding to your efforts, then you then again need to consider whether that is the right place for you to remain in. But one thing that I would say here, and I will say it repeatedly, is that whatever you do, never, ever compromise your integrity. As an information or IT risk professional, never compromise your integrity, because I said earlier that we are policing our organization's information assets. We're trying to protect our organization from harm. And to be able to protect an organization, please never compromise your integrity. A lot of these ISACA and ISC squared and other professional certifications always talk about ethics and values. And I'd say again that I try and sell myself. I don't even try. I've got it loudly and clearly written on my CV, on my LinkedIn profile, everywhere. It's written there clearly that integrity, that I value integrity. And it's important that when we're serving as information technology or information security risk professionals, we will see things, we will hear things in our roles. And we need to ensure that we don't ever compromise our integrity. If you're in a risk culture where your integrity is being tested, it's best to find another role and leave. But let's take a look at risk culture. Is the culture a place where everyone is required to comply with the policies, procedures, processes, regulations, or is it just certain teams or certain employees that are required to comply? If the culture does not mandate compliance from the top down to the bottom, then you may need to question your presence in that company. Are employees free to fail? Are they allowed to fail? Are they allowed to make mistakes? And I'm not talking about repeated mistakes here, but if they are allowed to do their jobs, is there room for them to fail? Or are they marched out of the company at the first sign of failure? Someone's clicked on a phishing link once. Are they blamed and simply marched out of the company? Or are they sent on phishing and awareness training? The board is responsible for ensuring that the risk culture is conducive to employees working there. Does the risk culture encourage risk taking? Why does a risk culture need to encourage risk taking. Can anyone put this in the chat window? And before we say this, let's just say something here in terms of risk taking. The 2008 or so to 2010 or whatever year it lasted to, that global economic crisis is what inspired me to move into risk management and to desire to want to move back into the financial services sector, actually. Why? What happened then that caused or that invoked or contributed largely to the global financial economic crisis at that time was excessive risk taking, which was encouraged by banks offering, incredible bonuses to their traders in particular. And so those traders who were mainly motivated by their bonuses simply took on trades that, that were too risky. They took on trades that were too risky, and then they tried to cover their tracks. And that ultimately contributed largely to that crisis at the time, amongst other things. Why then are we still saying that boards should encourage risk-taking? Any responses to that? And I see that Daniel has posted some responses. Yes, if a company does not encourage risk-taking, they cannot conduct business. They will not continue in business for long. Innovation requires a level of risk-taking. If a company wants to grow, if it wants to innovate, it has to encourage a certain level of risk-taking. But in addition to encouraging risk-taking, organizations, yes, and competition. It's so important. If a company wants to compete successfully in the markets, it has to encourage employees to take risks. However, if a company encourages employees to take risks, but it has a blame culture, punishes employees for failing, and if it doesn't reward ethics and transparency, the company will ultimately fail. Because if an employee is encouraged to take risks, but then they're punished when they fail for having taken that risk, or they're blamed if the risk that they take results in a negative outcome rather than a positive outcome, the company will fail. If the company does not reward ethics and transparency, where an employee is free to come and say, you know what, I have taken this risk that you encouraged me to take, and it has resulted in a negative outcome for the company will ultimately fail, because employees will be too scared to come and admit to a risk that they've taken that has gone wrong. So the risk culture is so important. Yes, and someone's just mentioned Kwaku, the UBS banker. Was he UBS? I've forgotten now, but Kwaku, most of us will have heard of that gentleman who took risks, and the risk ultimately didn't didn't pay off. Thank you. Yes, thank you. So it's been confirmed that he's from UBS. I just didn't want to mention UBS in case, we don't want to be, sued for slander or anything. Yes, so Kwaku Adoboli, the UBS banker, who took some risks, which resulted in major losses to the bank at the time. So if a company encourages risk taking, but it doesn't reward ethics and transparency, where you, as the employee that has taken that risk that hasn't worked, or a colleague can come and tell you, can come and say, okay, here's a risk. I noticed that this person has been trading excessively. If you don't reward that behavior, but instead you seek to work that person out of the business because they have been transparent with you, the company will ultimately fail because the rest of the employees will see what has happened to the person that has taken the risk, or to the person that has disclosed to you that they've seen a colleague engage in untoward behavior. And you've immediately blamed those people that have opened up to you, that have been transparent with you. If that is the culture of the organization will ultimately fail, or will continue to be fined by the regulator because employees will see things or do things and keep quiet about these things. Does the company culture dictate that risks are ignored? Or does the company culture dictate that we learn from those risks, whether they materialize or not? Questions?